For this morning's reading, Reverend Ben Perkins has selected from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 through 13. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love.
Good morning, beloved. It's great to be here. By my reckoning, 25 years ago, this past summer, I preached my very first sermon here at First Parish. That was right before I started my internship, so I was here from 1998 to 2000 when Reverend Dr. Thomas Michelson was your minister. And it's great to be back. I consider this kind of a homecoming week, and it's great to see some familiar faces. We're a little older and grayer, but we're still here. Amen. So what I wanted to do first is just start with another reading, and then ask for a moment of silence for prayer. So Piper Anderson, in an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called Building a Culture of Accountability, writes, in order to practice accountability with integrity and care, organizations must distinguish accountability from punishment. In this society, accountability is often synonymously related to or associated with punishment, shame, and or retaliatory harm. But she asks, what if it became synonymous with taking responsibility for harm, for making things right, for being willing to understand, change, and transform the harmful behavior and its underlying motivations? The difference between accountability and punishment has to do with relationships. And so now, if you feel so inclined, please pray with me. Great Spirit of life and love in which we live and move and have our being, bless the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts, that they may be acceptable in your sight. Amen. So a few years ago, and I don't remember the exact details other than I was likely writing a sermon or attending one of many racial equity workshops, I somewhat jokingly coined the term Gracism. I'm sure I didn't invent it, but I know that one of my superpowers is a good pun and wordplay. And Gracism got sticky. And I felt a strong desire to make meaning of it and to find its relevance in my life and work. I am drawn to it like a moth to a flame, which is reason enough for me to pay attention and explore how and why it holds me in its sway. Social justice work can be challenging on a good day and downright impossible on a bad one. Doing our part to be midwives for justice is a calling that is fraught with dangers, toils, and snares, as the old song goes. And it's perhaps this is why we need antidotes, balms for the soul that can aid us in remaining faithful to our respective callings, because it's easy to fall prey to despair and to cynicism and to become downright bitter and judgmental when the world and its inhabitants don't conform to our visions of a just society. Enter Gracism. First, let me say that I want to be clear that it is not about being nice, or what I have also coined kumbayaism, a shallow place of making nice to avoid generative conflict and to excuse problematic behavior. In his letter to a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. called this a negative peace, which is the absence of tension. And he contrasted it with a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. In grappling to articulate what Gracism is, I described it in the following words. Gracism is best defined as a mutual acknowledgement that we are all on a learning journey, that we are sometimes unskilled in our efforts, but that we commit to holding one another with a tender, loving embrace and an accountability that seeks to heal rather than wound. Reflecting on these words, I realize their connection to the Christian faith tradition, specifically today's New Testament passage from St. Paul. 1 Corinthians 13, also known as the love chapter, and arguably his most quoted words, especially at weddings, have profound implications for us. Suppose that we dig deeper and look beneath their sentimentality. In that case, these words are an open, radical challenge, for they are clear that without love undergirding our actions, no matter how noble or righteous we think them, our efforts are empty at best and harmful and idolatrous at worst. Yes, I think Paul understood that our lives, how easily our virtues can become vices, and that things designed to liberate can become weaponized, and that the law kills, but the spirit beneath the law gives life. Furthermore, he right-sizes us elsewhere in his writings by reminding us that we have all missed the mark, behaving in unskilled ways, and have fallen short of creation's glorious intent for us all. With all of this in mind, it begs the obvious question: how do we practice Gracism? And I want to offer 3 suggestions. First, we must remain curious. In a world of the tweets where lives are ruined in 40 characters or fewer, and outrage is a kind of reflexive religious practice, curiosity is countercultural and sorely missing. What would it mean to be curious at first? What would it mean not to conclude the worst of motivations immediately, but rather to seek to understand our fellow human beings? I'll be honest here and say that this is easier said than done. Still, I fear that without curiosity, we, especially those of us in progressive circles, become a kind of circular firing squad armed with piercing language and brilliant critique, or deconstructivitis as I called it, but utterly devoid of the humbling, ennobling love that Paul calls us to. The prologue to my sermon serves as a powerful example. The author makes it clear that accountability is critical to justice in the workplace, and she also understands that we live in a society that is often unable to animate it with integrity and care, hallmarks of love, and so it devolves into retaliation and punishment. Consequently, we end up with brittle call-out culture, isolated and fearful, and wondering why nothing changes. Coincidentally, it's a prime example of what I call the satanic principle, not in a metaphysical sense, but because by its very definition, the satanic is all about accusation and judgment. Needless to say, this should humble us all. Tema Okun, author of White Dominant Cultural Norms, a framework that many of us use in racial justice circles, provides a cautionary tale of the perils of her tool. She writes, "Many people are using this material wisely and well. Thank you for your thoughtfulness. Many people are misusing this material. The misuse seems to most often take the form of pulling out a characteristic or using all of them as a kind of checklist to target people, to accuse people of colluding with white supremacy culture, to evaluate or assess people, to avoid accountability and rigor in the workplace. I've heard stories of people using the article as a checklist to justify a critical work evaluation or a firing." Maurice Mitchell, racial justice activist, recounts his early experiences using the framework, noting that there were some people who used it to beat each other up or to puff themselves up. That is, my analysis is better than your analysis, and that I or we are more righteous than you. Mitchell wrote that what began as an intention to repair injustice ended up becoming a weapon to accuse, shame, and blame in ways that perpetuated disconnection. Which leads me to my second suggestion. Gracism should keep us humble. As Paul states, we know only in part. We never have all the information or perspective on anything, so our conclusions will always be incomplete. But no, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't act, but that we should always be willing to hold our conclusions lightly and to be ready to consider and course correct should the circumstances warrant. A few weeks ago, PBS broadcast a searing documentary on the desegregation effort in Boston that illustrated just how important it is to be curious and humble when reflecting on what that chapter of the city's history represented. As many of us know, this chilling episode in Boston's history was broadcast for the entire world to see. As a result, Boston's reputation as a racist city of the supposedly evolved North got cemented. Yet, as the documentary continued, I learned things that I didn't know that painted a more complex, nuanced picture of what happened. For example, the neighborhoods that were involved in the busing were poorer and had less resource schools. And so one could understand why both blacks and whites in those communities didn't really want busing, albeit for different reasons. I learned that the media coverage focused largely on violence and didn't show that many folks complied with the order and deplored the violence. I learned that there was a biracial parents' council that consisted primarily of black and white parents working to understand each other. And most surprisingly, I learned of the infamous 1974 Milliken versus Bradley Supreme Court decision that allowed suburban schools nationwide to escape court-ordered desegregation. The cowardly decision acknowledged that segregation existed, but not because it was mandated by law. Therefore, as the 5 justices in the majority opinion asserted, it didn't require legal action, effectively ensuring that schools in white flight suburbs would remain securely white. While I found myself angered and saddened by much of what I witnessed, I also felt humbled by what I didn't know, namely that the one-dimensional characterization of much of the mainstream media that they promulgated didn't allow for the complexities that were part of that history. None of this changes that there was brutality and violence, but it missed the fact that there were those who struggled mightily to find more humane ways through the tangle and bramble of that situation. We need to give them their due, I would argue, because they were examples of individuals and communities committed to practicing Gracism. Third, without a doubt, practicing Gracism wouldn't be complete without joy and delight. We need them to stay justice's course. They are the spiritual statins that keep our hearts from hardening, which is at the center of what I believe Gracism is about. When I sit in social justice circles now, I often ask, where is the joy here? Critiquing is important. Naming the powers and principalities is essential. But where are the joy and the delight in the beauty surrounding us here and now? Consider the lilies. Notice the color purple in a field. Where, oh, where is the love? Paul said it best when he noted that we become clanging cymbals without love. Moreover, in the words of one of my favorite poems, Jack Gilbert's A Brief for the Defense, he writes, "To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil." Beloved, I know that life is hard, that sometimes in the lamenting lyrics of the late singer George Michael, it's hard to love when there's so much to hate. But I want to submit to you that Gracism is a practice that broadens our spiritual aperture, expansive and inclusive, ecocentric rather than egocentric, enabling and ennobling us to embrace life's complexities instead of contracting. It's a spiritual practice that points to a spiritual maturity, enabling us to see and to love each other fully as creation loves us. And that, my beloved community, is a practice worth keeping. May it be so.